questions that, and sort of my thesis that I'd like to talk about, which is in designing this ethical framework to really keep the humanities at the table. And I couldn't be in Geneva, right on the banks of the lake, and not mention that here in 1816, Mary Shelley and her husband Percy, they joined Lord Byron for a summer. And one night at the Villa Diodati, which you can still see right across the lake from here actually, Mary, Percy, Byron, and John Polidori met for an evening telling ghost stories. And out of this evening, 4 works came that changed the literary scene forever, but most notably was Mary's novel Frankenstein, which was published actually 200 years ago, almost to the day. Now, Frankenstein was born out of Mary's concerns about the first industrial revolution. She understood the benefits of these massive changes, but she also understood the dangerous repercussions. Just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. In Mary's novel, Dr. Frankenstein creates a monster and unleashes it on the world. Frankenstein is a warning that innovative change without skepticism of thought and empathy for those affected can have disastrous consequences. So that was Mary's monster. And I'll tell you about my monster. I'm a professional musician, a record label owner, a music festival founder, and most recently I've become an artist advocate. I was the first creator to be given the podium at the Economic Club of Canada. I've testified before Parliament of Canada, keynoted at Madame, Banff World Media Festival, and Canadian Music Week. And I spoke with negotiators and policymakers during the NAFTA talks in Washington, which is where I met Ellen. So thanks so much for having me here in Geneva. But I should say that I'm really looking forward to getting back to doing my day job, which is being a musician, because I'm heading out on tour in the US next week, supporting the Jayhawks, which is one of my favorite bands. But I started my career in 1999, which was just as the digital revolution started to change everything about how music was consumed and how artists were remunerated. All the sectors were scrambling to adapt, to innovate, and to try and guess what directions this brave new world was going to take us all. Now, by now, I hope that you've heard of the value gap. It's defined as the significant disparity between the value of creative content that's accessed and enjoyed by consumers and the revenues that are returned to the people and businesses who create it. But what this means to me is that the others are commercializing my music and the music of my fellow creators, but not compensating us fairly. And the biggest reason for this is that the laws in place today reflect the days of dial-up modems and home phones and buying a CD at the music store instead of today's world of streaming. And just for some context, after the adoption of the WIPO treaties in 1996, it would be a full 2 years before Napster appeared, and 4.5 years before the introduction of the iPod, 6 years before the advent of the BlackBerry smartphone, and 8 years before the first video was uploaded to YouTube, and over a decade before the first song was streamed on Spotify. And I hasten to point out that there's nothing wrong with these treaties. It was how many countries chose to implement them. So now we know. Today, music is everywhere. Consumption has never been higher. I can play you every song ever recorded on my cell phone. And yet, remuneration of artists has not kept up. So I started playing my career with musicians who've come up in the 80s and the 90s and who were able to enter the middle class and buy houses and hire me at competitive prices. And my goal was to join them. But as I worked harder and harder and played on more and more records and more tours, I noticed that my measurable success as a musician was getting harder to measure financially. I started to realize that times have changed so quickly and so drastically that the hopes of belonging to the middle class, even as a successful musician, were disappearing. Now, in a time where artists feel so much pressure to exhibit shiny, glossy lives on social media, I started speaking out about some of the real truths about my industry, about transparency, and just about who the government and who copyright law is protecting. And as soon as I did, my creator colleagues reached out and they spoke up. and they confirmed that this was felt across the board and at every level of our music ecosystem. Our community is in crisis, and something needs to be done urgently. A colleague of mine who's an award-winning musician, he's younger than me, when hearing about a musician middle class, he said, "I want to be one of those." He'd never heard of this. He lamented that royalty checks that once paid for a down payment on a home for those lucky enough to be working before the digital disruption buy only a cup of coffee today. The musician middle class is gone, and even the ladder to get there is gone. In fact, for professional musicians in Canada, the average earnings from music are well below the poverty line. But I've been asked here to talk about what our world could look like in 2030, and specifically at the legal and regulatory environments that will propel us towards a better future. So unfortunately, I can't forecast the future, but what I do know is that we don't want to repeat the errors of the past. We don't want Mary's monster or my monster to return, so we can shine a flashlight under the bed. In both cases, in Mary Shelley's and mine, policymakers, those in power, made the same mistake. What was it? They all failed to bring their skeptical faculties to bear on the claims made by new technologies. No one asked, should we? And this is the central message of Mary's novel. We need to ask that question. And we need to have humanities at the table when designing these ethical frameworks. In Canada, we're in the midst of a self-examination process with a review of our Copyright Act to correct the mistakes of the past. And I'm encouraged that our elected representatives are seriously questioning the choices that were made 2 decades ago, and there's a genuine desire to rebalance the ledger. And I see echoes of this in the EU with their review of the Copyright Directive, and in the US with their passage of the Music Modernization Act. So we're starting to catch up. But our monster is actually the specter of repeating the mistakes of the past. An enlightened legal and regulatory environment should examine all truth claims with a degree of skepticism and should contemplate the potential results through the lens of empathy. That is what the humanities give us. Perhaps we can do better, and I'm optimistic that we can, and I look forward to that 2030.